Hello, everyone. Welcome to Real Talk with Tia and Jill. We are so excited to have you here with us today and a very special guest that you can see, Jennifer McEntire. Welcome.
Hi, Tia. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. So you all know us if you've been here week after week. Like we can't see you, but we can see your comments. So please say hello in the comments. Let us know where are you calling from or where are you listening from. We'll love to know. And then we like to talk about the weather a little bit. So Jennifer, where are you today?
I am home base in Frederick, Maryland, so not too far from your home base,
Yes.
Tia. And it has been a warmer than average week
Mm,
here in the Maryland suburb.
okay, because it was getting a little cool because of the rain that was coming in. But now it's warmer. We're missing the warm temperatures.
You are missing the warm temperatures, but I have a feeling it's warm by you, no?
It is. It is. It's pretty hot down here. So I'm in Tennessee. Jill and I were actually traveling to Chattanooga later this week. So she is actually on a flight headed to Chattanooga. That's why she's not with us today. But I'm in Knoxville today and it's hot. But I am getting ready for the fall. I have a pumpkin on my shirt. So I'm trying to get into the fall spirit. I'm ready for the cooler weather. I'm not quite ready for winter, but I'm ready for a little cooler weather so I can do more walks outside, that type of thing.
Yeah, I thought you just wanted a reason to wear orange.
Well, you do know I love wearing my orange from Tennessee. Jennifer has a daughter at University of Tennessee. You all know that I went to school at the University of Tennessee, so orange like is running through my blood and also now probably Jennifer's blood. Hopefully, if not, it will. We That's like my new goal now to get blood running through your veins. Well, welcome everyone. We see you. Cara, welcome from Wisconsin. Claire, welcome. Tess from NYC. I love New York City. I lived there for a few years in through COVID, and I miss it. I miss it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Joining from Nigeria. Welcome. I'm glad you are here today. We are excited to talk about our topic of distinguishing risk from hazards. And you're going to learn all about Jennifer in just a moment. But I do want to say if this is your first time joining Real Talk, we love being here every week. Jill and I, we love being here and just really having the real talk about what's happening in food safety. It's not webinar style, right? Like we like to get your comments in your perspectives, in your questions. So feel free to add all of that to the comments because we can see them and we'll make sure to answer your questions and incorporate your perspective as well. Because that's what we like to do. We like to talk about these things because this is really what's impacting culture for us, right? Impacting food safety culture at your organizations, but even the organizations that we touch at Catalyst. And you're going to even learn about Jennifer and her background and where she touches organizations, right? Like these conversations are important. And if this is your first time hearing about Catalyst, at Catalyst, we transform how people lead in food safety. And our goal is to empower them so that they can live authentically, so that they can achieve more, and ultimately enable business growth. That's our goal. And we do it through coaching based principles. Jill and I are both certified coaches. So everything we do is coaching based because of coaching really looks at that whole person and helps people tap into who they are so that they can lead differently and lead as fully as themselves versus trying to be someone else and lead, which we know does not work well. So, welcome to Real Talk. Without further ado, I do want to say hello, Jennifer. Please introduce yourself. Like, if you do not know Jennifer, this is the person to know. So, I would love for her to introduce herself. Tell us a little bit about, how you got into food safety and what you're doing today.
Sure. Well, thanks again for having me. It is quite a pleasure. I've been in the food safety space a bit over 20 years. So my degrees are in food science. I am a native Long Islander, even though I may not sound like it. I worked on the accent a little bit, neutralized as I kept moving down the Mid Atlantic.
Right. Yes.
So I did my undergrad at University of Delaware. I had the opportunity to do a little bit of research as an undergrad, put me on a nice pathway for graduate school. I went to Rutgers. Uh, I did the lab work, but I'm not going to lie, I didn't love being in the laboratory, and really, I wasn't even fully convinced that the PhD path was for me. But the faculty there that fortunately recognized that and said, well, hey, we have this internship in Washington, D.C. It would be part of your education. And so I spent 3.5 months at FDA, CIFSAN, and 3.5 months at what was then the National Food Processors Association.
Mm.
And as a student, I was also really involved in IFT. So I knew the Scientific Society as well. And when I finished school, IFT had a position open in their satellite office in Washington, D.C., which I don't think exists anymore. And I knew I wanted to go back to DC. I liked it. A lot of people don't, and I totally get that.
I like DC.
Especially nowadays, what craziness! But the seeing where science plays a role and having the kind of the shock that like science is not the be all end all in decision making in Washington
Ooh.
D.C. and feeling like I wanted to represent the science. I wanted to bring that to the conversation was very appealing to me, kind of regardless of who I worked for. And that's really always been my go-to stance, even as I've changed jobs. So I moved from IFT. I spent 8 years there working on food defense because this was the post 9/11 environment, traceability, a lot of career guidance, trying to promote the field of food science broadly to high school kids, college students. Then I moved on to work for David Atchison, who had been with FDA. When he left the agency, he started a consulting firm. And so I got a taste of consulting, doing a wide variety of things at the Atchison Group before going back to the association world, grocery manufacturers, and then most recently, United Fresh Produce Association, which became International Fresh Produce Association, where I was for the past like 7-ish years. And in May decided that I would go back to the consulting side of things. Wanted the variety. I wanted the hands-on work. That's how I got to know Jill actually a long time ago, was on the consulting side of things. And so it's been really fun and very satisfying to be challenged with all these different problems and see how people are seeing things and see where I can plug in and help.
Yeah, that is so awesome. And I hadn't heard your story from like going into food science and all the work that you did with IFT and in Washington, D.C. And that's awesome. And the impact that you have made and the teams you have led made in the industry, and when I think about my time in food safety, I've been in food safety and quality or, in industry for about 12 years. And like the impact you've made to produce has been phenomenal. So, thank you for the work that you've done. I know it hasn't been easy. I know it hasn't been because of that point you said, like sometimes science isn't actually driving decisions, right? So I appreciate the work that you've done, and I can't wait to see how you flourish over these next years.
Well, thanks.
So I want to ask you a little bit about your beginning. You said that you went into food science, right? And we always ask people, like, how did you know you wanted to go into food science? Because we always say, like, people don't wake up and say, oh, I really want to do food safety, right? Like, that's what I want to do. That's my passion. It's typically this winding road. So how did you find yourself in food science and then the food safety path?
Yeah, it was totally dumb luck. I'll date myself a little bit and say that when I was in high school and thinking about, did I want to go to college? What did I want to do? There really was no internet. We didn't have a computer in my house. There was no smartphones. So it was like getting that big fat book out of the library and thumbing through hundreds of pages of different schools. And really, I just looked at a map and I was like, I don't want to be too close to home. I don't want to be too far from home. So
Mm.
what fits there? And then what fits within my budget, which was not much. And my parents were like, you can, we'll try to afford for you to go to a SUNY school. If you want to go outside of the New York system, you're going to have to figure out how to make up that difference.
Mm.
And so
Mm.
I applied to a lot of the state schools, being the more affordable schools. And I wanted to do science, but I didn't want to be a doctor. So it was just like, I'm
Okay.
filling out the little postcards of biology, biochemistry, whatever. And University of Delaware sent me this packet of information. I get home from school one day and there's this envelope, fat envelope on my desk of, if you like science, maybe you'll like food science. And I was like, it was in the
Ooh.
ag college, really? Like I'm
All
not,
right, what is this?
I don't think that's for me. But as I looked at the 4 years, and the classes that I would take, it was very sciencey.
Mm.
And they had information from IFT that they'd pulled out and, packaged it nicely about types of jobs people had, starting salaries, the research going on in the department. And it was just really interesting. And it just seemed so relevant. Like I
Mm.
could understand how you would use science. I'd never thought about it before. I think a lot of people in food science, food safety, to your point, never thought about it before. But I was like, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. I'll apply to the program. What do I have to lose?
Yeah.
And if I don't like it, I'll
That's
find
right.
something else.
Yeah.
Like you always have those choices. And so fortunately for me, University of Delaware offered me enough scholarship money that it made it doable for
Mhm.
me to attend. I have since, I feel really fortunate that I have had a really nice career. I have no complaints. And so I've been able to establish a scholarship at the University of Delaware now to
Wow.
basically pay it back,
Wow,
give
that's
someone else that opportunity that I had. So that's important to me.
awesome.
And I would love to have more people in this field because it's just, we're so under the radar in food
Yeah.
safety and food science. And then, yeah, so as an undergrad, having the opportunity to do research, University of Delaware is a small department, super small. My graduating class was 4 people.
Oh, wow.
So not a ton of faculty.
Yeah.
My faculty advisor, he was the food micro guy. It was just like, I just got kind of thrown into it. And so I said, okay. But then, I liked it. I liked it. I would say as my career has progressed and I've seen more, I love it much more.
Mm.
I'm not going to say that it was like my passion from the get-go. It was something to do. But as I got more involved and met more people, I was like, this is just amazing. So
Ah, I love that. I feel like sometimes that's how passion sort of grows, right? And we need, like you said, we need more people in going into food safety, right? And food science and having that passion, like that's what keeps us driving as we look to make these really big changes, right, in food safety culture. But then also as we talk about like risks and hazards, right? Like that's a lot. That's a lot on our shoulders that we carry from a food safety standpoint.
I often say, the food safety people at companies, and perhaps you can attest to this, but the food safety people at companies usually are not the most popular people. You're like the people who say, no, we can't
Mhm.
do that. So
Yeah,
it takes a certain personality, I think, to persevere
yeah.
on the food safety side.
I agree with that. I agree with that. Okay, I also want to come back to the science, like what's driving decisions. A lot of times it's not the science, but I want to first talk a little bit about risks and hazards. And so let's start with risk. Like, how would you define a risk?
I think that is such a fundamental question for food safety. And I'd be super curious, if people want to chime in the chat now and comment of how do they define risk. And
Mm.
you probably have, a biased group here. I'm assuming it's a lot of people listening who are food safety people may answer it one way. You ask the general population, just the risk, what is it?
Yeah.
May define it a very different way.
Mhm.
The way that I was taught was, in the context of hazards and distinguishing hazards from risks, that risk is the likelihood or frequency of something going wrong, like that hazard being present, and the severity of the outcome or the impact if that bad thing does actually happen. So that combination, but I think we toss that term around pretty loosely
Mm,
and don't really think about those two fundamental pieces, the likelihood, frequency, and the severity.
yes.
Just kind of talk about risk like it's one thing. There's risk or there's not risk, and risk is a spectrum. And think that in food safety we have to make decisions. We have to prioritize, right? And so being clear of where something lies on that spectrum is critically important to doing a good job.
Yes, that's such a great point because I would even say I'm guilty, right? Working in industry, and I'm like, oh, that's risky, right? Like that's a risk. We don't want to take on that risk, but we might actually be talking more about a hazard. So, talk to us a little bit about a hazard and how that is different from risk.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people do use the terms synonymously, and they're not synonymously. Hazard is the thing. Hazard is the organism of concern. It's the pesticide, the heavy metal,
Yeah.
the bone fragments, the glass. It's the thing. Um, it's the object. You can touch it, you can feel it. You can measure it. It's the thing. Whereas risk is the chance that thing that you put all your systems in place, right? You have all your preventive systems in place to prevent that thing from being in your product, but inevitably things happen. And so how often they happen, and then the consequence if it does happen, that is the risk.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that many people like you, Tia, use the term interchangeably and call really what are hazards, call them risks without doing the math, whether it's a quantitative math or a more just kind of an intuitive gut feel math of how likely is this to occur and how bad is it going to be?
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're not all equally bad.
Yes. I think that this is something where we talk about all the time in food safety. Food safety is black and white. Quality is gray, but food safety is black and white. So when you start to think about, though, the risk and looking at, okay, well, what is the likelihood? And then what is the severity if something happened? Then it does become a little bit more gray, right? Because now we're looking at, okay, what is the likelihood here in my system with the processes I've put in place, with the people that I have working in the facility, from my education, knowledge of food safety, but then even what do they do, right? Like we have training, but do people mess up often, right?
Right.
Again, what is that likelihood? And then what's the severity? Is going to get out the door, right? Like, or how is it going to impact the consumer? And
Yep.
so that, I think sometimes that makes us as food safety people, that almost makes us a little like, ugh, like I want it to be black and white, right? Like it's easier when it's black and white. But in
Yeah.
reality, like we're not doing ourselves a service or even our organization a service if we're not actually thinking about and calculating that risk. Even if you said like it's a gut risk because of what you know.
And if you can start to lay out these different scenarios, different types of hazards, the different risks associated with them, then it does allow you to prioritize and put resources where they're going to matter most.
Yes. Yeah, that I mean, such a great point. Many people that's listening here, like they have or is working in an organization where they have many, many tasks, but not enough resources to get them done. And so when you talk about prioritizing a risk, that's really what you have to do if you're going to go after the one, right, with high likelihood, high severity, right? Whichever is the highest for you, right? We think that's the path you should take a look at, and see if you can eliminate that risk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at least
So
minimize.
minimize it. Right, right. Because sometimes you can eliminate it, but can you reduce that likelihood or that severity?
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious, like, as people, because some people, this might be the first time that they're really hearing about, like, oh, how do I talk about risk versus how do I talk about hazards? What are some tips that you can give to food safety professionals as they consider engaging in these conversations around hazards versus risk with their management, but then also with their cross functional teams that might not understand this?
I think there are a couple of things to consider. One is to start the conversation by asking people at, anywhere at any level, what does risk mean to them? And let's get on the same page in terms of terminology, because I've also found, being in a food safety profession, generally hanging out with food safety people, we'll talk about hazards, we'll talk about risks. And as we're thinking about that severity, we're thinking of public health outcome, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Could people get hurt? How many people are going to get sick? How sick are they going to get? Like, it's a very public health oriented field.
Yeah.
And then it dawned on me one day, not that long ago, that when I'm talking to company leadership, of course, they care about public health risk. I do not mean to imply that they don't. But when they're thinking about severity of an outcome, they're thinking often about money. How
Mhm.
much is this going to cost the company if
Yeah.
we are going to have to recall, or if there's going to be a lawsuit? They're thinking, and some of the food safety and kind of compliance people are also thinking about regulatory risk.
Yeah.
Am I going to get in trouble?
Yeah.
And what's the severity of that? Or
Mhm.
a reputational risk. If
Mm.
something goes wrong, what are my customers going to think? What is the general public going to think? And so I always just thought about risk and severity in terms of public health, but to see that it's so much more than that. And the
Mhm.
way that people are defining it, the way that people are thinking about it may vary so widely that, as the food safety person with a technical, scientific background, going into that conversation, if you're talking about public health and someone else is talking about business risk, you're not on the same page.
Yeah.
If someone's talking about business risk, someone's talking about regulatory compliance, not necessarily the same.
Right. Exactly.
And so, starting with uh, just laying that foundation of getting the terms out there, having a mutual understanding of what I'm talking about versus what you're talking about, and having that recognition as the food safety person. And this is often said, and as we're talking about food safety leadership, that you do need to be mindful of those business concerns, the
Mhm.
business considerations. And so, how do you present risk as you're thinking about it in terms that are going to resonate with someone else? I think
Yes.
the other thing is to be kind of cognizant of the risk tolerance of an organization,
Ooh, yes.
even outside of food safety risks, but to think about, how does my company work? How does my organization work? Are
Yes.
we risk takers? Are we that company that's at the cutting edge?
Mhm.
Hopefully we win, but sometimes we lose, where we kind of pushing the envelope, that entrepreneurial startup kind of
Mhm.
risk taking mentality? Or are we very conservative,
Mhm.
not big risk takers? We
Right.
like our systems, we like our routines, we don't
Mhm.
want to rock the boat. And so, as you're talking about food safety risks and how they can be managed, I think having that in the back of your mind too, of just what's the overall culture of the
Yeah.
company, what's their overall risk tolerance, can help you frame what you're talking about, so that they, so that you can be more successful in the conversation.
Yeah. When I think about your number two, right, for someone that's worked in the startup world, that is so important because I feel like as food safety people, like we want to be on that conservative side, right? Like we don't want our organization to take these wild risks. We want it to be predictable. We want to have processes in place. Like that's when we feel comfortable. And a lot of times it's because we're thinking about that public health risk. But there's so many other people in the organizations, and typically the CEO, the founder, as well as the senior leadership or the rest of the senior leadership outside of food safety, they're thinking about how much risk can we take on to continue to grow, to make more money, right? To be in different spaces, right? And sometimes it could be, if we don't do this, like we will cease to exist as an organization. And so there's these really real realities that are also there that's kind of competing, for I don't know, space or time, right? Resources even to focus on. Then okay, how do I eliminate all of this risk that the organization might be comfortable with taking on?
Yeah, as you start to think about it from other people's perspectives, their job roles, the space that your company occupies in the food sector. It is not clear cut. It is
Yeah.
not the way that food safety people would like to say, like, yes or no,
Yeah.
risky or not.
Right.
Things
Right.
become complicated.
Absolutely. I think this goes back to what you said earlier around decision making, and that sometimes decision making isn't necessarily like science based, right? Like, and then when we think about this, we're thinking, of course, you don't want to take on this risk. Of course, you want to protect your brand in this way. Of course, and it's almost like the data is driving us, right? The science is driving us. But like you mentioned, like a lot of people are not making decisions based off of science. And when I've done things like, I mean, now likelihood and severity, people talk about it in terms of FMEA and like what's the likelihood of equipment breaking down and that type of thing. And you think that it will be super simple for us to agree on the likelihood and the severity, but you realize that emotions are a part of it, right? And people's perspective that might not be science based. It might be anecdotal, or it might be whatever, right? It might be my grandmother or the way my family was raised. Like all of these things start to play, even when you're trying to decide like what's the severity and what's the likelihood. Have you seen that?
I've seen many food safety plans, HACCP plans, the hazard evaluation charts, and where people are assigning numbers to likelihood, assigning numbers to severity, and then kind of what's the total score and what does it mean. Even within a company, for a particular hazard, sometimes you'll see different severities associated with the hazard, and it's like, well, how could that be?
How
That
could
is what it is, right? Like,
I?
so yeah, that for as much as we may want to have things well defined in our little chart of what score, what defines a 1 versus a 2 versus a 3 versus a 4,
Mhm.
when it comes down to it and people are assessing a particular situation, there's more subjectivity sometimes that goes into it than one would think. And I
Yeah.
think to the extent that we have data and we can use data, it's best to use it.
Yeah.
Always be able to defend your position, why you ranked or scored something a certain way, why you've made the decisions that you've made. But there is a lot that goes into it, whether we're conscious of it or not, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious what your thoughts are around, if you're in an organization and as the food safety leader, you're saying that, we do not need to take on this much risk. We need to bring it back down, right? And eliminate this risk or mitigate this risk. But the organization is saying, no, like we want to take on this risk. We're comfortable taking on this risk so that we can continue to grow our brand, so that we can continue to not spend money here, but spend money there. What would you say to food safety professionals that are in that spot?
So I love giving options. I think that that's the best approach, and it's pretty rare from where I sit, where I've come from, that things are just totally off limits.
Yeah.
I want to be able to find a way. Like, help
Yeah.
me say yes. help me
Mm,
agree to this.
yeah.
And so looking at a specific situation, and my recommendation may be to do something that the leadership says like, nope, we're not going to do it.
But yeah.
Then I think the job of the food safety leader is to clearly communicate why.
Mhm.
Here's what I'm seeing. Here's the data that supports my analysis. Here's my recommendation. Here's my first recommendation. Here's option A,
Yeah.
which I highly recommend. But if you're not going to go with option A, here's option B, here's option
Mhm.
C, here's option D. And here are the business risks, the regulatory risks that are associated with it. If
Right.
the company chooses to take on those risks, then I think at least having that package of information together that clearly lays out, like, I don't want to say a CYA, but to
It is,
but to
yeah.
clearly lay out, here's what could happen and here's the likelihood that something may happen. So you need to understand that if and when it does happen, we all were aware. And here are
Right.
the things that we're going to do here to try to minimize the chance that it happens.
Yes.
But let's all accept this risk together. Now,
Yeah.
that said, there are some bright lines where a company may want to do things that you cannot sign off on because they are super bad, super dangerous,
Mhm.
and may get you in trouble if that
Yeah.
bad thing happens. Then it becomes a very, very difficult situation of figuring out, well, what does my future with this company look like if this
Mhm.
is the attitude they have, if this is the approach that they're taking, if they're not listening to me, if they are kind of just dismissing
Yeah.
this what I've put together and all the background, and they simply don't care, then do I really want to be? Do I want to take the risk,
Right.
personal risk of working with this company?
Yes. That's big, right? Like it's about knowing your boundaries, right? Like
Yeah,
how much risk are you personally going to take on with the organization? What is like your no-go, right? Where it's like, okay, if you're doing this or you're taking on this risk, like I don't want to be a part of it.
right.
You know, I love to on like I think like that's the extreme, and there's many people that's there though, right? There's many people that's been there, but like the extreme is like you need to understand your boundaries. But once you understand those boundaries, I love it how you talked about like giving options and being clear about what those risks are, because like I see it where a lot of times, and I've been there early on in my career where this is the right path to go down, and that's where you are. But really understanding to your earlier point on like the culture, right, and how they manage risk and what risk they want to take on, given options and being able to say, okay, if you go with option A, then your likelihood, your severity low. If you go with option B, this is how it changed, right?
Right.
And this means if an auditor comes in and they ask you this question, we're not going to be able to answer it, right? Or it might be
Right.
right, and sometimes you're like, and I've been there too, where people are, I'm like, okay, if we get asked that question, I'm not going to be able to defend it. It's going to be written up, but I can take that on. Right. And so, like, knowing those, of course, I don't want to, right? So, it's not going to be a part of my option A, but it might be an option B that I'm still able to explain this is where we're working. But if an auditor asks us about this program, we're going to have to say no, right? Like, but for the organization to understand that, for the team to understand this is the risk, and we're all holding hands and saying that's the risk we want to take on, so that if it comes up and it creates an audit trail, and then we're having a conversation about corrective action, we can all say, yeah, we knew that was a risk and we're ready to take that on.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as we have these conversations, like what do you wish people knew when we talk about like distinguishing risk and hazards? And particularly from that leadership lens.
What do I wish people knew? Ooh, the list goes on, right?
We have a little bit of
I,
time.
I, s- I see a lot of Well, I just see a lot of confusion in terms and kind of complacency in and habit. Maybe I shouldn't call it complacency. Maybe I should just call it habit of the way that people talk about things, even the way that they approach things. And I don't know if there's a reluctance sometimes to challenge, like
Mm,
why are we saying that? Why are we doing that? A or lack of time.
yeah.
I'm just
Mm,
going to do what was done before because
mm.
that's the way we've always done things. How often have we heard that, right?
Yes. Common
Um,
phrase.
so I wish food safety people were a little more kind of creative in their storytelling.
Mm.
Uh, we usually come from a scientific background, which is not often synonymous with creative storytelling,
True.
but but I wish that food safety people would become a little more conversant and colorful in how they're talking about these things with leadership. And I wish that leadership would, well, it's a partnership. It should be a partnership between food safety and the rest of the team, and not view food safety as just always being the bad guy, always
Yeah.
putting the brakes on things, always asking for more money with no ROI. So I think that food safety could do a better job explaining here's where we're coming from. And yeah, you have options. Here's what option A costs, option B costs, option
Mhm.
C costs, and the risks, and that leadership could be engaged in that conversation
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's very unfair, I think, when leadership imposes sort of a double standard. I've seen at times, not always, but at times where leadership is like, well, you're the food safety person, you make the call,
Yeah.
except I'm not going to let you do that.
Right. Yep. Yeah. And I'm sure people in the audience, like, they've been there, right? Like, give her a hand raise emoji if you've been in that position where it's like, no, 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 you make the decision because you're food safety, but no, you're not going to make that decision.
Right. So
And that makes sense. I think, when we think about like culture, right? Like we need that mindset of leadership to change, right? So that so like you said, they can be more engaged in the conversation. Um, and then also on the side of like, and which, Jill and I, that's what we talk about on how do we equip our technical experts with those skills to be able to tell more colorful stories, to be able to influence, to tap into these soft skills, human skills, right? That we're not taught in school, right? Like we're not taught in school, and nor were we promoted into leadership positions because we were great at those human skills. We were promoted because we were great at, you know, data and translating that data and saying like these are the facts. And then we get into a position and then all of a sudden we're like, these are the facts. And they're like, no, I don't want to do that. And
I don't
you're
like
like,
your facts.
right, I don't like your facts. Actually, no, I don't like these. I don't want to do that. So yeah, I completely understand where you're coming from. I'm curious on as you think about those things that you wish people knew and shift in, how do you think that relates to culture and food safety culture?
It it part and parcel, like indistinguishable.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
where how is food safety viewed within the company, within the team? How is it food safety culturally viewed? Is food safety the ally? Is food safety the enemy, the internal
Yeah.
enemy? So
Mhm.
um, I think that these are all intertwined.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, how do people relate to each other? And I have seen food safety people who, surely would benefit from your programs who take that hard line, like, no,
Mhm.
this is what it's going to be,
Right.
and that doesn't always work well.
Mm-mm, mm-mm. And I would say as we grow, just as a global culture, like you can tell like that's not the way. It's not the most effective way to get work done anymore. It's getting
Yep.
less and less effective.
Yeah.
What do you think gets in the way of people really being able to communicate this to be able to get on the same page around risk, hazards, food safety culture?
Well, I think we all erroneously assume that other people are like us, that
Mm,
other people think like us, that other people understand us, that what we think we're saying is what someone else is hearing.
yes.
So I think that gets in the way a lot of just kind of beginning maybe at step 3 of the conversation and not bringing people along like, okay, let's start with step 1, let's move to
Yeah.
step 2, just jumping into step 3 and thinking that others are right there alongside you when they may not be. And once you start to have that initial disconnect, then I fear that people probably tune out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's part of what gets in the way of how to use food safety. How do you start to create that buy-in? How do you build that rapport? This is a component of that. And then you have a fraction of people, I think, depending on the part of the food industry that we're talking about, that is very compliance focused at the expense of critical thinking.
Ooh.
And
Yeah.
and they don't ask questions of themselves. They do things the way that things have always been done. And I think that gets in the way of progress because things
Mhm.
change
Yes.
in the space. Our scientific understanding changes,
Mhm.
the way that people are using products, the types of products you're manufacturing, the way you're manufacturing them from an equipment technology standpoint, things change. And I think that having that, check the box, like
Mhm.
I'm doing the same thing I've always been doing.
Right. Yeah.
It's very limiting.
Yeah. And I think people forget that about science is that it does change over time as we learn, as we collect more data, right? And so if we stayed rigid in science, right, like we wouldn't advance at all.
Right.
And I think people forget that, just even scientists, right, and engineers and people who handle this data, we forget that we have to continue to understand what's our current climate, what's the current data saying, what are we learning from past data so that we can continue to advance. Okay, we do
For
have a
sure.
couple of questions. So Laura first asked, how are you liking your new job?
Laura knows that I am loving my new job.
Awesome. Yes, yes. Okay, so she also asked, how does one start if they have a small voice?
I think it's finding champions.
Mhm.
One thing that I just neglected to say early as I was kind of talking about my career path and my journey is that I got incredibly lucky right out the gate that in my very first job at IFT, my job basically was to convene groups of experts. So from day one, I was surrounded by just incredible, iconic people. And to have access at a very young age, to have access to these people who were like superstars of food safety was super cool. And to get to know them and to learn from them, to soak up all that they were willing to share with me, which was usually a lot because food safety people love to talk about
Mhm.
it. We're all very proud of what we do, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it having their that they saw potential in me, that they were confident in me, that they saw like, wow, we're these old guys, you're here coming up. Um,
Yeah.
that was encouraging to me and help build my confidence so that I could um, do a better job advocating for myself, advocating for
Mhm.
whatever the food safety topic was. I am a natural introvert. I am not an extroverted person. I am not uh, I think people would be surprised as they see me now, and
Mhm.
I'm out and have maybe I have a big voice. I don't have a small voice anymore, but like I used to have a very small voice, and it just took that time and that investment that people made in me to make me feel like, okay, I you know. So I
Yeah.
think latching on to some champions, some allies, some mentors, some coaches who can help develop you and find your unique voice. So
Mm.
not emulating someone else's style or mimicking them, but to really be introspective and think about who you are, how
Yeah.
you want to be viewed, and get the support from the outside. uh, there are fortunately many ways to find mentors, formal or informal, and coaches.
Mhm.
So I think that there's opportunities for people who feel that they have a small voice to reach out. First step one is reaching out.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. I think you like really hit the nail on the head because like if you if you feel like your voice is small, right, then you're probably going to talk like it's small, right? And so how do you develop that? And I love the idea of finding your champions because your champions will empower you. They'll also speak, right? But they'll also empower you to start to speak.
Yep.
And even if we feel like, so I'm on the other spectrum of an extrovert, right? So I'm always trying to get in, right, and talking. But when you start, like you feel like you don't really know much. And I'm a chemical engineer and I had no food background when I stepped into food safety. And so I'm in a space that, working with food scientists who this is what they studied. And so I feel like, man, like I don't know if I should say much, right? Because I don't know if I have much to give because I don't have that background. But when you find those champions that's pushing you to say, yeah, you know your stuff, and you're here because we need that different perspective. Like we need where you came from. We talked a little bit about like needing, we have to advance, right? So we have to change, we have to understand the current climate and where we're going. Those different perspectives are needed for that.
I think when you feel like, well, I'm a little bit of an outsider here. I'm not the same discipline, maybe I'm not the same age, whatever it is that makes you feel like I don't quite fit in here. The approach that I've often taken is just to ask questions. Instead of coming in like you're the know-it-all and you're
Yes.
gonna impose your perspective on everybody and you're gonna school them. If you ask good questions, thought-provoking questions,
Mm-hmm.
um, people think you're smart.
Yeah, that's true.
Like you're just asking a question.
Right. Yeah. People be like, I've never even thought about that. Let me think about that a little bit more. Right. And sometimes you're like, well, I just really wanted to know. Right. Like I wasn't
Right.
trying to do anything special. I just honestly wanted to know. But that's how you're like adding volume right to that voice because people even say, oh man, I need Jennifer in the room because she asked those really great questions. Even though she might not understand everything that's going on, like we want her in the room because she's going to ask those questions. And that's going to make us dive a little bit deeper and think a little bit differently than what we've been thinking about over the last X amount of years.
Precisely.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so Douglas asked a question on how often do you analyze that data? And so, Douglas, I think that you're asking around, and please add into the comments around clarification. But as we think about like risks and the data around that, how often should we be looking at that data and analyzing it to make decisions?
I I'm a big fan of thinking about it all the time. Like when you're driving, when you're in the shower. I know that there's the do it once a year, every 2 years, every 3 years to sit down formally. And sure, you should be looking at things as a team on a regular basis, but things do change. And I think sometimes when we're managing a large portfolio, large sets of data, it's difficult to keep track of everything that you have under your purview, and to think about, well, I made one change over here that
Yeah.
should trigger another change over there because they're similar enough.
Yeah.
Um, how you can systematize that. I think there are, well, better tools today than
That's true.
decades ago. And I'm kind of excited to see where some of the big data analysis goes. A little nervous too.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it takes the human element away from it. But if we can have systems that can do the mundane work,
Yeah.
the easy work, and be able then to bring our human critical thinking skills to really think about what do these trends mean?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
what am I going to do about this? The decision making piece of it. Then I think that's a good use of people's time.
Yeah. I think so too, because it takes some things off your plate, right? That you can spend more time thinking about it critically and implementing right solutions to close gaps versus spending a lot of time trying to look at the data, trend the data, and like you said, relate it to other parts of the organization or the facility that might be under your umbrella. Okay, we have a question from Tess. How do you push to be included in some of those conversations that aren't distinctly food safety focused, but ultimately have a food safety impact? Well, that's a good one, Tess.
I think the first question I would ask myself is, why am I not being included?
Mm,
So is it just the people that forget about me? That they don't see it being food safety related? I do.
yeah.
And then you go down one path. Is it because people do know that there's some food safety implication and they don't want to hear what I have to say?
Mm,
Where I'm being maybe a little more deliberately excluded.
yeah. Yeah.
Then I think the approach needs to change to get your foot in the door and to get your voice heard. So I think thinking about it yourself of like, what are all these possible reasons that maybe I'm outside of this conversation,
Mm,
and then doing a little elbow rubbing and asking like, hey, what's going on over here, like,
mm-hmm.
and see if people will be honest and give you the feedback of why you've not been included, and then you can strategize.
Right. Yeah.
Do you need to build a better case? Do you need to show people why this is related to food safety? Do you just need to show people that you can be trusted?
Mm,
That do you need to show people that you add value to the conversation?
yeah. Yeah.
So so I
That's good.
think that the answer is a little bit of it depends.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's a great place to start because then once you know, like you said, you can start building your case around it. And then you can start pointing out examples, right? Like I used to have conversations with my operations team, and I'm like, you should always have maintenance in the room, food safety, engineering, operations, right? And logistics if it's going to mess up the schedule. Like always have those core people, even if you think that if they're not involved, they can make the decision to not come.
Yep.
And so I would point to examples on like, oh, when was this discussed? Oh, I wasn't invited. This is how I could have helped in this situation. And then we wouldn't be having downtime. Then we wouldn't have this conversation. And then I too would be at lunch. Like I too would be doing something else because we would have had this conversation early on. So you can start pointing to those examples of, I remember we had a huge failure where there was some metal flaking happening, and it's because someone made a decision, and I would have said, hey, that would lead to metal flaking and we would have to shut down if that happens, if I had been included in the conversation to do something while we're running, right? And then so now it's like, well, we have to go down for sanitation now, but we could have saved that time if I was a part of the conversation. And then, like, literally after that, I was involved in everything. I mean, literally, I think like 10 meetings got forwarded to me, and I had to say, like, well, I'm not going to be there because I'm only one person. But I appreciated it, and I also said that, like, I'm here to support you. And I'm
Yeah.
here to support the operations, and I want to make sure you're set up for success because it's not great for any of us to go down for sanitation early and to have metal fragments, right, possibly in product. Like that's not great for anyone. So in order for me to support you, I have to be a part of those conversations.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah. Okay, as we look to end, I want to, Laura kind of talked about like just the impact that you have, right? And the fact that, you really take things seriously. I really want to know like what fuels your passion in this area.
I'm pretty curious, and even though I am an introvert, I'm always curious about how people got to where they are.
Mhm.
It just the personal side of things really interests me,
Yeah.
and I'm fortunately I'm not someone that's had catastrophic experience, personal experience with food safety. We know that some people enter the field and they have incredible passion because of terrible things that have happened to them or their family members, and I'm very thankful that so far that's not me.
Yeah.
But I have had an opportunity to work with these people and to see the real life impact that food safety has. Plus, I just love food. Like, I love it. I love food. Um, and there's so much that goes into food, and food is such a part of every culture, that
Mm,
having the opportunity to work in food compared to other fields that use science, where science, you have to use science and technology to create lots of products, but I
yeah.
just think that food is it's a great thing.
Yeah.
So that's part of what fuels me, is just that things continue to change. There are continued challenges. I'm curious about what people think of these challenges and how we're going to get through them together, and want to see people enjoying food the way that I do.
That is awesome. I too love food and love it that is a connector, a global connector for all cultures. So, Jennifer, you've stepped out on your own, you're back in consulting. How do people get in touch with you and learn more about what you have going on?
Sure, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so I have my personal page, just under my name, and then I have the company page under food safety strategy. I That's probably the easiest way to connect with me, is on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Just following me. I put out a lot of blog posts, and get my opinions out there. My company does have a website, super easy. It's just foodsafetystrategy.com. Um, but I think that I'm pretty accessible. It's not that hard to find me.
That's right. And you're connected to this particular talk on LinkedIn. So find her name. You can click right on it and connect with her. And then you talked about your blog posts. I love your food safety FOMO. Tell us a little bit about that.
Starting in my early days at United Fresh, and actually starting at GMA, I had wanted to put this it's like a little newsletter out. But I'm not very patient, and I don't like to read a lot of things. I want the top line message. What
Yeah.
do I need to know? And if I want to look more, then I want to click a link and look more. But I don't want to be overwhelmed with a bunch of superfluous content and
Yeah.
have to wade through and figure out what's important. So at United, I put this just bullets together. The five, never more than 10 items of here's what's going on, with a little bit, just like one sentence of what do I think? What do
Mm,
I think is important? What do I think is notable? So moving beyond the press release of the basic facts, providing a little context,
yeah.
uh, just in a sentence for key things that are going on. It started at United Fresh, continued through IFPA, and as I went out on my own, decided that I wanted to keep it up and expand beyond produce, because my business is more than just fresh produce. It's food safety broadly, but I have not been quite as disciplined about getting it out as I should be. But I I appreciate that people read it, that people find value in it. I've gotten a lot of good feedback, and it helps keep me up to speed on things. It
Yeah.
forces me to uh, read some of these things that come out, and take a moment to think about how is this worth sharing, and why? Why
Yeah.
is it worth sharing?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you have not read Food Safety FOMO, please check it out on Jennifer's LinkedIn. You can find one of the blog posts on her LinkedIn. Just connect with her. You'll see it posted. And then follow her because she does put those out. And no pressure to keep putting them out in any frequency. We know that you're busy, but I love it when it graces my LinkedIn. I'm like, ooh, a new FOMO. Because me, like as an extrovert, I definitely don't want to miss out. So I have this FOMO. My husband's always like, I think you're having FOMO. So I relate to the title of the blog. Jennifer, thank you so much for being on Real Talk. Like your experience and your perspective, we appreciate it. And we are so happy that you are here talking with our audience and giving us a little bit about, something to think about as we grow as food safety professionals. So thank you so much for being here.
It has been my pleasure. So thanks for having me.
And we will be back next week, every Wednesday at noon Eastern, 11 Central. So please join us again next week. We'll see you later. Bye.